biggest changes I receive and I hear back are in the lives of mom and dad of these kids, right? Because they are going through these vicariously with their kids. Right? So that's something for me that really set my trajectory here, seeing that for the first time, and the emotional release that a mom had when her daughter said, "I love you," for the first time. People who are in pain, it's a terrible thing, pain's terrible, but what happened for that mom that day doesn't compare. And so that's really where I jumped off and knew this was something I wanted to go into. So that's a little bit about me. Right now, the hardest part about these presentations for me isn't so much as finding out what to say, but what not to say. Because I'm super into this stuff. I geek out on it a lot. You'll probably hear me today. I'll ramble maybe a little bit. I'll get off trajectory. So if I do, just say, hey, get back on task here. And there's a lot to talk about. There's a ton to unpack with kids' health. Right? Hours and hours. We don't have that amount of time today. And by the end of the presentation, most of you guys are going to be like, thank goodness we didn't have the time today. I'm not going to listen anymore. Feel bad for my wife. She's with me a lot. But it is my goal today to talk about some of the most misunderstood and overlooked aspects of development within kids that are vital for their success as they go through life and into adulthood. And so, the things that we're going to discuss today, they're vital for development, for setting that path up for success. And if that trajectory is changed at all, it literally changes the way your kids are experiencing the world. Right? So even though they're in the room with you, how they're interpreting that situation might be completely different from your own. Right? And that's a stance that if I do anything today, that is what I hope you leave this room with. Is that next time you encounter a kid who is struggling in some of these areas, you have a different lens with which to view what's happening in their lives and why they're doing what they do, why they're acting the way that they are. And so I call it out of sync because I don't think that there's really one little cause. Again, if we could go into that, it's been a lot of time. There's a lot that goes into this. But at the end of the day, these kids, whether they're diagnosed with autism, ADHD, whether they're just having struggles, right? Sleeping issues. It comes down to these fundamental issues, the layers of health not being lined up. So I call it out of sync. And what does that look like? You've all seen it. I don't think there's a person in the world, in the US for sure, that hasn't seen this, right? Whether that's the child who has a meltdown when they're moving from one activity to another, or maybe it's a really big sound that just sets them off, right? The kid who can't sit still, constantly trying to do something, looking for input in some way, shape, or form, right? Maybe it's the kid who's super reserved, who's not actually doing anything, right? Sometimes this looks like parents who feel that just something isn't right, but they're being told that it's okay, they'll grow out of it, right? That's my least favorite thing to hear. In my experience, kids don't grow out of things, they grow into other things, right? And so addressing this early is vital. So before I go too deep into this, I want to start off with one of my favorite stories from the past year. And this is with Landry. So Landry came to us, and she had whole ABCs that are being given to kids these days, diagnosed. Specifically, though, she had sensory processing disorder, a receptive and an expressive speech delay, a social pragmatic communication disorder, and severe articulation of speech issues. And that's just a few of them. And I'll never forget the first real visit in the office when we were actually starting to work with her, what happened. So it was the first little minute of it, and we got her adjusted, got her some attention, and so kind of like a break time, take a little bit. She gets off the table and she goes into our corner and starts playing with some of the toys. And I watch her go over and I turn around and mom's just staring at me. And she says, "What did you do to my daughter?" And as a practitioner, that's either one of the best things you can hear or it's one of the worst, right? And so now I'm like, and you watch me, like I didn't do anything. I just adjusted her, stimulating a little bit. And she goes, "That's not my daughter. My daughter never would have gotten up off the table and just went over by herself and started playing with toys like that." sakes. Well, we just adjusted her, but that's cool. That's awesome. I didn't really notice that because I haven't worked with her a ton. What I did notice over the next couple months was when she came into the office, she was using 1 to 2 words to communicate. Over the next couple weeks, that turned into full sentences, that turned into paragraphs, eventually turned into full stories, and nearly full expression. Okay. The biggest change that I saw was that it wasn't just to mom anymore, that she was actually talking to me. She was communicating with me. Right. Over this time period as well, mom kept receiving feedback from the people she worked with at schools. They were expressing to her how much more integrated she had become with her peers. She had gone from a social watcher, right, somebody kind of a bystander, to somebody who's actually engaging and participating in social things, in friendship, at school. So that was something it was just awesome. It happened really, really quickly, and it happened in really big ways. And mom was very communicative with me about what was going on, so that was awesome for me. But this didn't happen because of magic. It didn't happen because we gave her some kind of a pill. It happened because of a lot of dedication from mom and dad, and it happened because her brain and her body were finally back in sync and in tune with one another. We often don't understand, and we take it for granted because it happens so easily for us. We don't even think about it. How much something like speech is affected by how well we're actually feeling our body in our own self, right? How well we're responding to the stimulus coming in from around us, right? Huge impact. So the beginning of development, it really starts with communication. Your body sends information to your brain. Your brain has to take that in and decide what to do with it in order to send a message back out to the body to create an appropriate response, right? So you can think of it as kind of like a two-way radio, right? If that communication on either end of that two-way radio gets changed or misdirected, it will change the outcome, right? You're only as good as the information you have coming in, right? Opposite is true. If your output is off, it's going to change how your input comes back in. Okay, so it's kind of a vicious cycle that we can get stuck in. And this isn't just kids. Adults, we can go through this too. So when this loop gets affected, as we said, the kids get out of sync. And at this point, it's really easy to get focused on behaviors. Super easy to get focused on what these kids are doing and think that that's the actual problem. But these are symptoms. They are not the problem. They are intelligent forms of communication from the body and the brain saying we need help. They're red flags that it's throwing up, saying, hey, something's not happening fully right here. Something's not happening right. So when we address them as symptoms, we can only go so far. Right? And that kind of goes for health in general. That's what America is doing really, really well right now, is addressing symptoms, and it's not getting us anywhere. So today I want to take a second and look at actually the underlying principles of development that if we track and map out, we can actually move the needle with these kids. We can actually change the symptoms. Okay? So we don't develop randomly, right? You just don't. Shit happenstance. Like one person's eyes don't develop at this point, and the next person's develop at 3 years. There's a developmental timeline and trajectory that takes place that everybody follows. And it's when that trajectory gets off by 1 or 2 degrees, and by the time you're 8 years old, it creates a big problem. Right? And so again, this is all very, very simplified. But I refer to this as the developmental triangle. And you cannot build the higher levels of this pyramid without the foundational levels being solid. And what you don't see here, I refer to it as the whole white here, because it is the biggest key to health across the board, and it's energy production. It's what upholds all of these pillars. Right? So if you are not receiving enough energy from the food you're eating, what you're intaking, if you are not changing that food, those building blocks, into actual energy for your body, you cannot heal, you cannot develop, you cannot progress. So if we come in and we start working on ocular issues, but their problem is at an energy metabolic level, we might see small changes, but they're going to go away as soon as we stop working on it. We have to understand that. So the base level is energy. We're going to talk about more of these in more in depth individually. The first thing that really happens for development is primitive reflexes. Right? These involuntary movements, they stimulate baby to actually start interacting with the world. Once those have served their purpose, the vestibular system really comes online. It starts to help baby child to not only interact with the world, but understand that interaction. Once that is fully online, it leads to the eyes being able to start to work more cohesively together, to track things through space, to be used with your body and separately. Again, something we all take for granted, but it's super important. And it's only when these base levels of survival are met that our brain and our bodies feel comfortable enough to start directing energy and effort to higher cognition. So that's things like problem solving, learning, social interactions, right? Those are all, if you go on that hierarchy of needs, those come later, only after we have that survival base set up. So cellular energy is really where this starts for most kids. It's something like 80% of kids diagnosed with autism have a mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay, so mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, right? We all remember that. Right? If that is not creating enough energy, you cannot heal. 80% with autism specifically have a mitochondrial dysfunction. Yet, I have not had a single kid come into my office that has ever had that looked at. Big thing, right in our face most of the time. We're just not looking for it. And it's not just mitochondrial, but this can be due to anemia, right? If you don't have enough red blood cells, which carry oxygen through your body, you can't deliver that oxygen very well. You're not going to create enough energy, right? Sometimes it's just you're mouth breathing. You're not getting enough oxygen, period, right? There's a lot of things that can be the cause of this lack of energy, and we've got to figure that out. And there's simple tests that we can run. They're functional labs that are very accurate, and they tell us right away, do you have a bacterial overgrowth? Do you have a fungal infection, right? Do you have autoimmunity against your own brain? Again, many kids that have these issues, they're actually attacking their own body, kind of like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation all the time. So if we don't get that addressed, we cannot, again, make true progress and keep it long term. So the next thing that really comes along is those primitive reflexes. Who's heard of primitive reflexes before? Okay. If you haven't heard about it, I'm surprised. It's kind of like a buzzword now. But these reflexes, so who knows what a reflex is? Okay, what's a reflex?
When you hit your knee and it kicks.
Right. It's that involuntary reaction that happens because another stimulus occurred. So primitive reflexes, these are inborn involuntary reactions that babies have. And they are vital to their success. They're literally keeping that baby alive. Right? So when baby comes into the world, it doesn't know it needs to eat. It doesn't know it's hungry. Yet if you brush its cheek, it starts turning to that side, rooting around looking for food. Right? That's a reflex, the root reflex. You put something in the mouth, it should start to suckle on that. Again, doesn't know why it's doing that, but it feeds it. Right? They need to use their hands, but yet if you put something in their palm, it grasps it. It's a palmar grasp reflex. And probably the most famous one that people recognize, and it's the parent's worst nightmare, is when you go in to set that baby down, you just got it to sleep, right? And you go down a little bit too fast, and it startles, right? It wakes up, you have to start all over again. That is a moral reflex, startle. That reflex actually is training that baby's nervous system to go into fight or flight. A very important aspect of survival, especially if we look at this, 300 years ago. So these reflexes, they're vital up front. If they hang around too long is where they start to cause problems. Because at this point, they will start to impede higher levels of brain function, right? They'll compete for resources and attention from the brain, right? So can you imagine if you've got a palmar grasp reflex, right, where your hand wants to close based off something hitting you, and you're a kid at school trying to write with a pen, and that reflex is going on. Do you think it's going to affect their handwriting? if they've got a spinal galant reflex, which is where if you go and run up a baby's back with your finger, they're gonna jerk to that side and they're probably gonna pee a little bit, right? If you've got that as a kid trying to sit in the chair and reflexively have this urge to move, I think they're gonna have a hard time sitting still, focusing on the board. You betcha. The worst case is that moral reflex, right? So a lot of times I don't see kids that'll have a big response, although it does happen, right? If I clap, whoa, big one. Most times it's a small inside reaction where that loud noise really startles them, puts them into fight or flight, right? Highly associated with anxiety, fears, and emotional dysregulation as they get older, right? And it's something from a reflex. It's not something they're choosing to do or react with. So knowing that this is going on, most of your kids have had this checked. They were checked when they were a baby because we know, and it's well accepted, that they're important at birth. But as long as they're there, they never really look at them again. They don't check to make sure they're actually going away on time, right? And if it's causing issues later on. So a simple thing that we know is just not being looked at. So signs of these reflexes being retained: toe walking. Anybody know somebody that walks like that? I see a ton of adults do it, right? You've got another reflex on the bottom of your foot that will essentially cause you to kind of push back, to pull back from your foot. Big with that toe walking, right? We've got poor posture and fidgeting. We already kind of talked about that. Anxiety, poor handwriting, difficult transitions, emotional regulation. All of that can come from having these reflexes stay active after about that first year of life. And the kicker with this is the earlier we find it, the faster we can get these reflexes to integrate, right? If a 2-year-old comes in and they're still having a really active moro, they're in that zone still. They're right in that transitional period. So getting that to integrate is a lot easier than a 14-year-old who's got it, right? We've got to really kick the brain in the pants to try to get back to that zone to develop there. So the earlier the better with a lot of this. Now, if you remember that pyramid, if those reflexes are all under control and they've integrated correctly, it allows your vestibular system to really come online. So your vestibular system is your inner ear, right? It senses balance and coordination. If you're getting vertigo or motion sickness, it's coming from that inner ear, right? So that inner ear is where you receive this information, but it's actually processed in your cerebellum. The cerebellum, let's see if this thing's got a little, yeah. So cerebellum is this little guy back here, okay? Small part of your brain, but that part of your brain has more neurons than the entire rest of your brain combined. And for the longest time, we were taught that cerebellum was movement. That's all it did. And we know that is 100% not true. It is directly linked to timing and rhythm, right? To speech and to emotional regulation. Okay, so if the cerebellum is not receiving proper stimulus because a reflexive action is constantly fighting for that attention, it's going to go underdeveloped. It won't map out well enough. So again, you end up with an 8-year-old that can't coordinate his emotions, right? His or her. So what this looks like is a lot of clumsiness, disorganized, right? Again, the poor regulation, the poor emotional control, transitions, really difficult at this point. And just lack of understanding what your body is doing. So if you can kind of picture this, if any of you have ever been in a completely dark room, you didn't know, you've never been in this room before, you don't know what's in there, and you can't see. Have you ever been in there like in a cave sometimes? It's kind of one thing I think of. Right? How comfortable are you in there?
Not.
Do you go milling around and kind of checking things out, hoping you just don't bump into something? No. If you move, it's very cautious, right? You're not taking a bunch of risks. So can you imagine that if a child's cerebellum is underdeveloped, if their vestibular system is not collecting the proper information about where they are in space, that they might have a hard time acting what we view as normal. Right? 100%. So the vestibular system, we talk about is the inner ear, it's the sensory organ for the cerebellum. But like we just talked about, this understanding of where our body is in space and in relation to itself is very, very grounding. If you do not have that, you do not feel safe. Anxiety is a huge thing here, but just not feeling safe. I cannot express that enough. That a lot of times the kids that come in, the way they react is because they are subconsciously in a fight or flight. They are worried that they are in danger because they're not understanding their environment. Okay? So have any of you ever had vertigo or gotten really, really motion sick? Yeah? Okay. So right there, it's hard to do anything with that, right? And these kids, it doesn't mean that they're constantly spinning and that's what's going on. But when you have that extreme overstimulation of that system, you can't do anything. It shuts you down, right? And so a lot of times with this, it goes both ways. This can be understimulated or it can be overstimulated. So again, if you've got that kid who just sits there, they don't like movement, they don't want to go down the slide, they don't want to go on the swing. And on the other side of that, you've got the kid who won't sit still. They're constantly jumping off things, they're hitting their head, they're constantly looking for that input. So it can go both ways, but the reaction is the same. They do not feel at home in their bodies. So if that vestibular system fully develops, right, it makes way for your ocular system to come online. And I'm not talking about visual acuity, right? How well you read this sign, how well you can see details. That's a separate aspect. And in fact, a lot of kids have undiagnosed eye issues because you can pass an eye exam while having these issues because they're not looking for it, right? So it's estimated like 25% of kids that have issues at school have an undiagnosed eye motor problem. They can't coordinate their movements, right? So what this looks like is if you can't focus on something as it moves in closer to you, maybe you start to see two. I had a kid come through the office, this is the worst I've ever seen, at 3 feet out, he saw 2 pins. I use a pen to come in now, right? He was 8 years old. Nobody knew because his entire life, that's what he had seen. So he could not tell somebody, hey, I'm seeing 2. He didn't know that was not normal, right? Do you think that affected his ability to focus and learn at school? 100%, right? And these kind of movements, they're directly tied to a few of these reflexes. It's really these reflexes, they prevent your brain from being able to work one side with the other. And when you cross your eyes across midline, you have to communicate between the right side and the left side to make that transition where one eye is leading, one eye is following. So if you have some of these reflexes present, it'll prevent that from happening very well. So when you're reading, maybe the right side, which is more powerful, that comes first all the time. Maybe it's the left. And they call it dyslexia. But really what's happening is it's a motor control issue. You cannot get that timing down, right? Again, nobody's looking for this. And this goes for a lot of other things too. You'll actually just fix it. I've got a girl currently in the office who, if I ask her to look at something, she can't do it. And it's because of other reflexes that are involved with your neck and your eyes. They're oculocervical reflexes. So if her neck turns, her eyes automatically go to where her neck turns to. She cannot overpower that. And so this is something we all want, right? If you get hit from the side and you're going this way, you don't want to be like, oh, I need to look over here to catch myself. You want it to happen. But if I ask you to stare at my nose while I turn your head, you better believe you want to be able to do that and overpower it, right? So these kids, they might not be able to do that. So again, anytime their head's moving, their eyes are going with it. They can't control that. Most of them have no idea that that's not normal, so they cannot express it to you well. So eye function, huge here. Okay. All of this culminates into sensory input, the information our brain is receiving. So I always refer to it as a puzzle, right? Our senses are what are bringing different puzzle pieces to our brain. And it should make this nice, clear picture where our brain can then say, okay, I understand what's happening, let me make an appropriate response. Now let's say some of these sensory inputs are changed. Maybe some of them are really fast. Some of them are so slow that they actually don't actually hit the brain. They don't stimulate it to set off a response. So now your brain is operating with this puzzle that has a whole bunch of missing pieces in it. it's gonna make up those pieces. Whether it's the truth or not, it's gonna tell itself something so it can make a response. And a lot of times that response is worst case scenario, okay? Fight or flight. Does that make sense? Right? So, again, a lot of people are, in fact, I just talked to a lady yesterday, bless her heart, talking about her grandkids. She's got 2 of them that are autism, have autism, both level 2. And she told me, she's like, I feel terrible about this, but I can't stand those kids. Mm-hmm. Right? And again, bless her poor her little heart, she's looking at it from her lens. She doesn't understand why this one is going up and smelling random things all the time. She looks at it as weird and kooky, right? The other one flapping his hands all the time, constantly bumping into things. She's saying, well, why can't you just stand still, right? When we understand it from a different lens, though, that smell might be one of the only things that this child is processing well enough to experience. And so they're constantly going to look for it, right? If they're not receiving enough vestibular input, they're going to bump into things all the time to try to create that so they can, again, start making sense of the world around them. So now, all of a sudden, I hope that kid who puts himself in a box and doesn't want to leave the house, we understand that a little bit more, right? It's not something they're choosing to do. It's something that they're driven to do, and they don't know why. And they can't tell you. And so when these systems are out of sync, right? Again, going back to what I said earlier, if you have bad information coming in, you can only expect bad information coming out. So how do we fix that? Do we go and we just focus on those bad outputs, right? Which is what traditional approaches here have done. Let's give you a pill that's going to override your brain response to make you sit still. Or let's go to a behavioral course where we're going to try to force you to act a certain way, right? Those all have their places in certain moments. But there's a reason why a majority of kids come into my office and they've done 5 years of behavioral therapy and they haven't gotten anywhere. Because that behavior is not the problem. It is a symptom of it. So tracing this developmental pathway back and getting a look at these foundational systems helps us to then create a neurological roadmap of how to actually correct this and bring balance back to that information coming in and information going out, right? And so at my specific office, the approach that I use is we start everything off with a functional neurological exam, right? So I'm looking at how well those eyes track. I'm looking at how well they're moving in and out. I'm checking balance and coordination. I'm checking to see, is one side able to go longer in a movement than another? All of this paints a picture to me of where within the brain is active enough and where it might not be. Where is overactive, right? Based off of this, we can start to say, okay, we need to give input to your right frontal lobe. We don't want any more to the left, right? And there's a lot of ways we can do that. We can have you wear colored glasses to specifically light up that part of your brain. We can apply laser, which is going to provide the cells in that part of the brain with energy so that when we stimulate it, they actually can make the changes they need, right? I use tonal chiropractic as the basis of what I do. And this is different than your snap, crackle, pops that most people are familiar with. That's really heavily focused on movement and joints, which sometimes we need that, sometimes we kind of get locked up. Most of the time with kids, their joints really aren't even set 100% yet. They're not getting stuck that often without some kind of a direct trauma. So the tonal approach I use is more about how they are responding neurologically to stimulus. Based off that reflexive response, I can figure out where and when and how they need stimulation to reignite, reconnect that area. Basically, we can get the brain to turn up the volume again on that part of the body. And so that information starts coming in better, so it can start coming out better. If I follow that up with specific movement, rhythmic activities, the areas of the brain are firing really fast now. Now we're feeding it information to start building with, and we get a lot faster result, right? And so sometimes parents kind of laugh at what we do in the office because they're expecting some really crazy stuff. And it's not. We are doing things that babies and children children should do all the time. Rhythmic movements, exposure to different positions over and over and over again to map that part of their brain out. And again, to bring balance so that when right side and left side need to work together, no one's overpowering the other one, right? It creates fluid, it creates symmetry and comfort within these kids. So, who this works with, honestly, I see a lot of different people. So in adults, it's funny, I don't see a lot of behavioral issues in adults. What I see is lack of function, right? Your brain's developed enough so that if you're having this imbalance, it doesn't come out as a lack of control. You can override that, but you can't really control how well your digestive system's working. That's something that happens automatically. So I see that a lot, specifically with head injuries, people who have a concussion. Remember those primitive reflexes? Those are safety measures, they're survival. You hit your head hard enough, your brain is going to say, I need to protect myself and make sure I survive. So those reflexes can come back. That's why sometimes people get that concussion and 2-3 years later their health is just steadily declining, right? It's because those foundational levels of survival are no longer firm. And so those higher levels of function can't stay active. With kids, it's the whole neurodevelopmental umbrella, right? That whole ABCs that kids are getting diagnosed with. But a lot of kids that come in too, the parents, they just know something's not 100%, right? Talked to a lady today, actually. She's been to several doctors and her daughter's not speaking yet. And they all tell her, oh, well, she's young, like it'll come around. She's like, I've had other kids, like this is different, right? And it is. At the age that her daughter is, she should be mimicking what she sees. So unless she's put in a corner and nobody talks to her, she should be mimicking that. Now, should she be able to say these words perfectly? No. Should she understand what they mean 100%? No. But she should be trying and attempting to say them, right? So this looks like a lot of different things, but it helps out tremendously. It's often the overlooked key to actually making progress with these kids. That's permanent. So we do have some time where I can answer some questions here, briefly, but if this sounds familiar, right, and you want to learn more, you want to talk more individually, like, let me know. I can address something specifically for you or talk to you more about what is going on personally for you and your families. If you know anybody outside of this room that kind of just done and they don't know where else to go, please let them know that we're an option, that we're here. That's my number one thing, is that people just have no idea that this exists. And they're not being told it at their pediatrician's office, because most pediatricians don't know what it is either. So again, thank you for your time. And yeah, I've got a couple minutes here, I think. So does anybody have any questions or want clarity on something?